Hello and welcome to Reimagining Entrepreneurship. I'm Professor Edgell. Today in Module 2-1, I want to talk to you about, of course, the module topic, which is business modeling and strategizing. And to do so, I've broken it into two parts. A part A that focuses in on the strategy component, so we can learn about that and learn about how strategy connects to business modeling. And then there's a part B, which is focused on business modeling and some of the real deep details around that. Okay, so let's get started with the part A, strategy. And I'm going to try to answer these questions. What is strategy? What is business level strategy in particular? And what are the business level strategic or strategy options? We need to know that because we're going to have to choose options for our venture so that we can then do effective business modeling. I'm already giving you some answers and some hints. So let's move into this question about what is strategy. And I want to begin by giving you some advice how to first conceive of strategy, right? And we usually say it's best to think of strategy in the very beginning in terms of three questions. So what are those three questions? The first one is, what's the venture's present situation? And I think in your case, the answer is going to be, we're pretty much not much of a venture yet because you're in the early conceptualization and formation phase. So there really isn't a situation yet. You'll soon be coming into a beginning infantile, if you will, situation. But for now, let's say we're at zero, essentially. So we know the answer to that question. The second question is, where does the venture need to go from here? And certainly your venture needs to go somewhere because you want it to become something, right? We're trying to, enact this concept that you're formulating now. And that means you need to formulate goals for this venture. And often those goals relate to understanding the needs of those people you want to serve, right? Because without doing that, we don't really have a purpose for the venture. So we need to understand the buyer's needs and the groups that we want to serve and the kind of businesses or the kind of business and market position we want to stake out. And as we go throughout this little lesson, I think you'll learn more about what that means to kind of develop the business and market positions. But it does mean to understand how your venture will compete against other ventures offering something similar, if not the same. Now, the third question, this really is the meaning behind strategy, is the question, how should it get there? How will this venture achieve these goals that we set for it? And strategy is the answer to the how will we get there question. So you're going to be setting out some goals for this venture, some things that you'd like to see the venture achieve in the marketplace. And strategy is how you will do that and enact that. And it plays out at both a conceptual level and in particulars. And we're going to understand that more as we go throughout this lesson. So there are these three questions. And sometimes when we're strategizing, we're actually working with an existing firm, maybe an existing startup, right? So there is a present situation, just to loop back to that first question. But in your cases, I think in all the cases here, we're kind of in the stage of just forming these little ventures. So we don't really have a situation, but you will have answers to questions 2 and 3, right? Certainly you will have that. Now, goals, let's understand the distinction between, because sometimes students get confused about what's a goal, what is a strategy and what is a tactic. So let's run through some concrete examples, and you can see them up on your screen now. Let's start with the first one here. As a new venture, you might have a goal of selling some new product, and you might want to do X% of sales. You might say, I want to sell X amount of units of a particular new product. Your new firm will be offering up some combination probably of a product and or service. And so you might have a goal of selling X amount of that. And that's your goal. Then you'll need a strategy. Now, one strategy could be to acquire new customers. And certainly as a new entrant or as a new firm or new venture, you'll need to acquire some new customers, no doubt, right? So your strategy is to acquire some new customers, and a tactic would be to launch an email campaign, maybe with the value proposition in the email campaign. So you can kind of see the difference here. Strategy is the conceptual approach to answering the question, how are we going to sell new product? Tactic is the actual action. It identifies the action. So every strategy will have a series of actions or tactics under them that enable you to enact the strategy. Want to acquire new customers? Okay, how do I acquire the new customers? Well, I need to reach out to them in a concrete way and offer the product to them. And it could be an email campaign. It could be a social media campaign, right? So many different tactics one could take, but the big strategy is I'm trying to acquire new customers. The second example, and these are just examples to clarify this distinction amongst goal, strategy, and tactic, right? So the second one is increase product case sales. Let's say you had an existing product and you want to increase the sales. And your strategy could be to improve customer retention. We're losing customers at X rate. I'd like to reduce the amount of customers we're losing because it's sometimes cheaper to sell to an existing customer than it is to acquire a new one. And my tactic that would enable me to improve my customer retention would be to build an online or digitized customer service center that gives me better data and therefore enables me to better offer existing customers what they need to keep them in my stable of customers, right? The third example might be, you might say at some point I want to increase profit, and I might do that by reducing costs and by digitizing the supply chain. And to achieve that, my tactic might be to implement an ERP system, Enterprise Resource Planning System, right? So here's some examples. So I hope this helps to clarify the distinction amongst these three different concepts. One being the goal, the next being the strategy, the third being the tactic. And they usually flow in this order, by the way. If you look on the screen, you'll see, first you've got to have the goal, then you formulate the strategy, and then you think about the concrete actions you can take to enact the strategy that will enable you to achieve the goal. Now, here's some examples of business level strategy. In a moment, I'll talk more about the various types of strategy, but I can say now, as you can tell, we're going to be very much focused on business level strategy throughout this course. And business level strategy takes two broad flavors, low cost or differentiation. In a moment, we'll learn more about that, but low cost means that you will compete on cost. Differentiation means that you will compete on offering better quality, perceived quality, perhaps at most likely at a higher cost, right? And here's some examples of leaders in the industry that use different strategies at the business level. And so we see some low-cost providers here. Walmart, obviously, right? In the retail industry, Walmart clearly competes on cost. Southwest Airlines for many years has competed on cost as well. They provided, fairly decent service for relatively low cost. Now, what are some examples of companies that or ventures that compete on differentiating features? Well, Johnson & Johnson, reliability in baby products, right? Harley Davidson, king of the road styling. You pay a premium, but in exchange for that, you get something that people seem to really like, or certain groups of people seem to really like. Rolex, top of the line prestige, obviously for watches. BMW, engineering, design, and performance. Again, you pay a premium for BMW. But in exchange, you get this much higher quality, perceived quality. And I always think it's kind of funny, Johnson & Johnson. Yes, we like reliability in baby products. You don't want your baby harmed, and you're willing to pay a premium to feel or believe that they're getting access to a safer, better product, right? Because you like your babies. At the business level, value is a function of price and perceived quality. And when we move into the business modeling section, you're going to see how important this is. And value is the point at which strategy connects into business modeling, right? So value is a function of price and perceived quality. price is pretty straightforward, I think. I think most of us understand that. We've all done some shopping in our lifetimes. And when we talk about quality, we say perceived quality, because some aspects of quality are much more concrete, but other aspects are perceptual. And let's talk about quality for a moment. Quality usually falls into three broad dimensions. There is utility. How useful is the product vis-a-vis the intended purpose for that product? And of course, most consumers like high usability. But then there's also durability. Durability. So how long does it last? How long does it maintain its utility over time before I have to replace it or start fixing it? And one can only think of cars, right? You could have a great car in terms of its utility. It does a lot of what I want. It performs in the way that I like it to perform. But, that particular brand starts to break within a couple years of purchasing it. So the durability is lower, perhaps, in a relative sense, right? Now, the third dimension is aesthetics. How pleasing is it to use, to see, to experience? How pleasurable is it, right? So these are the three typical dimensions of quality. And we say a lot of these aspects are perceived, so we just tend to refer to quality as a perceived quality. And what's interesting, and we'll get more into this as we go throughout the strategy session or lesson, but firms can choose to either compete on low price, and that means, my offer to you is that I give you the best price. I may not give you the best quality, but in exchange, I give you the best price. And one can only think of Walmart. You may not always get the best quality in those products at Walmart, but certainly you're more than likely getting the lowest price or near the lowest price in the market for those particular products. And of course, the other choice is to compete on differentiation. And here, I'm not promising you the lowest price, but I am promising you some aspect of higher quality, be it utility, durability, or aesthetics, or a combination of all those. And one need only think about the BMW, right? I give you a better package that often hinges on engineering performance and durability, but in exchange, you're willing to pay more for that than say you would for the Chevrolet, correct? So let's now talk about the hierarchy or the different types of strategy. If you were thinking about a big corporation, think about Alphabet. Alphabet owns Google, right? Google is one of many, many businesses now owned by Alphabet, right? You would be concerned about various different levels of strategy. And at the broadest level, you'd be concerned about corporate strategy. And that is setting the overall direction of the company and the management of all of its businesses. So we often call corporate level strategy portfolio strategy. You've got a portfolio of businesses and you're concerned about how to manage or optimize that portfolio. So it's so much about portfolio strategy. Next, we have business or division level strategy. And this is how the individual businesses either compete with others, businesses, and or cooperate. So here we're talking about competitive and cooperative strategies. And then the last primary level at the narrowest part is functional strategies. And that's how we maximize resource productivity. So if I look within an existing business or division, I look at the functional areas. I look at marketing. I look at operations. I look at finance. How do I optimize my resource deployment within those various areas to help me meet my business level strategy? And in turn, all those businesses, their strategies should go together to help me meet my corporate level strategies. So we always want to think of these three levels. Now, given that we're focusing on new ventures, we are going to be preoccupied with business level strategy only. But ultimately, long term, a small venture begins as a business. And of course, we will be somewhat concerned about functional level strategy, but not totally that concerned about it. Because when you're starting a small business, an entrepreneurial startup, you wear many hats, and marketing is not so discrete from finance. They're very tied together. In fact, the person doing marketing may also be doing finance, right? But over time, they grow into being discrete functions. And when they do, we absolutely need strategies for each one of those functional areas of the business or of the venture. But what's kind of cool is that if you think about this, a venture long-term can grow, if it's successful, can grow and branch into many businesses. And think of Google. Google began as a startup venture focused on providing online search. That's how Google began. However, where's it today? It's a big, massive corporation that owns many businesses, including Google Search, right? And so it grew from being concerned about this small little startup venture and being concerned about how that venture would compete against Yahoo at the time. Yahoo was the real primary competitor for Google when it began. But then as time went by and it was successful, it blossomed and had all these other businesses, and it had to develop corporate level strategy. And as that little venture, Google Search, grew, so the leaders of the particular small startup had to be concerned over time as they grew and matured, as that particular venture unit grew and matured, had to be concerned about developing concrete strategies for each one of those functional areas. So all of a sudden, now we're larger. We need to worry about marketing in a more concrete way, make sure that we're balancing and providing the right amount of resources there to optimize productivity across the entire firm. And they had to do that for each one of the functional areas. But that comes later in the life stage of developing the venture. Early on, we're less concerned about that. So in this particular course, we're not going to address that as deeply, just because you're going to be more concerned about business level strategy and launching that venture and getting it up and running. And to visualize it, one could think about the corporation, and this happens to be a corporation that now has, hypothetically 3 businesses. So each business, we'd have to have a business level strategy. We'd have a portfolio strategy for the overall corporation, and then we'd be worried about each individual business, and effectively that we'd be worried about or concerned about how does that particular business compete against its rival set. And that, of course, hinges on the particulars of that business. Are these 3 businesses in different industries? They might be. Could they be all in the same industry? They might be as well, right? We don't know that. We're talking conceptual. And of course, each one of those firms, those individual ventures or businesses would have to be concerned with ultimately, at some point, with their sub-strategies in each functional area. Now, again, as I mentioned, we're going to focus in on business level strategy only because your little venture is going to be preoccupied with that. Now, let's talk for a moment about how strategy connects over to business modeling. And as I've already mentioned, it connects through the value proposition effectively. And again, strategy deals with your venture's competitive initiatives and business approaches. And that's really answering the question, how? The business modeling is so much about understanding whether revenues and costs flowing from the strategy demonstrate that the business can be viable, essentially, right? So you need, and you need both of these, both a solid strategy and then a business model together, right? Together to have an effective business plan. And the business model really has to support that strategy. If you're going to compete on differentiation, if what you're providing if the value you're providing your customers is higher, better perceived quality at a higher price, then what you do internally and your cost will need to reflect that, right? So it's important that as a small group, your little venture team, as you start to formulate your business model and develop it, you need to think first about what is our strategy. And in our lesson later, now you're going to learn more about the particular and the options to formulating the strategy. I will, in this lesson on particular strategy, business level strategy options, I will refer to CAPSIM. It is a simulation that we often use for this type of course. We're not requiring you this particular time to do that. Use CAPSIM because you're actually doing a business plan competition. So you're going to do the real deal. So we don't need a simulation. But I've included that content material from CAPSIM because they give very, very specific definitions for the various business level strategic options. And I think it's useful for you to read those and see those. So I've included those in this lecture, but you will not be required to do the simulation. Rather, you're going to be doing the real applied learning through creating the business level strategy and business model, and therefore the business plan, and then pitching it at a business plan competition. And this whole idea of business level strategy revolves around this idea, the notion of a sweet spot. And we think about the customer's needs, and we think about what the competitors are offering to fulfill those customers' needs. And of course, they may be doing a pretty good job at meeting some of the needs, but probably not all of them. And then we think about our company and our capabilities. And we really want to think about where our capabilities will kind of give us a superior advantage over the competitors' offerings so that the customers will be even more pleased with ours. So we think that that is the sweet spot, and competitive strategy is about getting us to that sweet spot. So what do? Well, competitive strategy deals exclusively with the company's plans to compete. And we usually compete on a given competitive advantage. And we know so far, we've talked about this being either price or differentiation. And we get to being superior in terms of price or differentiation by having the necessary distinctive competencies to support either one of those competitive advantages. We talked about that in particular in our last module. And that means, what are we doing? So we think about competitive strategy. It's really about what are we doing to please the customers? What are the offensive and defensive moves that we would use to counter the maneuvers of rivals? What do we do in response to the current market conditions? And lastly, what are the initiatives that we're going to undertake to actually improve or keep this market position? And of course, my question to you is, why is it important to decide which generic business level strategy is best for my company? Why do I need to know that now? Why can't I just wait and let it evolve and kind of see where it takes me? Well, we need to know it because it guides our functional level strategies and tactics. Without understanding what my big purpose is, my big strategy and big purpose is, I don't know what to do with my functional level strategies, nor my tactics. I don't know how to maneuver on a daily basis if I don't know what's guiding me, right? And we use cooperative strategies. I know sometimes students ask about cooperative strategies. We use them only when they enhance our competitive position. So they are subordinate to the competitive position, not the other way around. Just want to make that clear. We're not going to talk a lot about those because I think those are pretty straightforward, and you can find some evidence of those or some information about those in the textbook and other places. But when we engage a competitive or cooperative strategy, it needs to be one that suits or meets up or fulfills or helps us to deliver on our competitive position. So what are the generic business level strategies? Well, it's really simple. There are only 5. This is the wonderful part of this lecture. There are only 5. We have overall low cost provider. We have broad differentiation strategy. We have best cost provider. And we have focused low cost, and we have focused differentiation. So there are only 5. And again, it goes back to this idea of, we have a competitive advantage, and it's either going to be differentiation or lower cost. And we need to adopt a kind of market perspective. And do we want to go after just a narrow segment of buyers, or a niche, as we sometimes say, or do we want to go after a broad cross-section of buyers, right? So from that, if we put all that together, we get these 5 particular options. Now, one thing I want to talk to you about, too, is that best cost provider strategy is not in our textbook because there is disagreement among economists as to whether or not this is a viable or legitimate option. Now, I'm in the category, I'm in the group that kind of says it is a viable strategy, but it is a very difficult one to do because essentially you have to find this constant moving balance point between some differentiation and some low cost. And it's a continuous process, and it's almost like the two fight each other. So while on the surface it may look very seductive, it may look like, this is a great way to go because I'm going to be all things to all people in a way I don't have to decide anything. But the truth is, it is the most difficult one to implement because that balance point between a little bit of cost savings and a little bit of differentiation is constantly changing and moving in the marketplace. And so it's a very difficult one to do. It's one where you think, you kind of
gain some mastery of it, and then all of a sudden the marketplace is shifting again. So it's very, very difficult to do. And we're going to talk more about each one of these in a moment, but this is your high-level map. And ultimately, you need to choose one and kind of stick to it, right? You need to choose one, stick to it, and kind of make it your expertise, if you will. So let's talk about some examples of each one of these. Well, Walmart, of course, is a wonderful example of a company that's been very successful at pursuing a overall low-cost business level strategy. Nordstrom's, on the other hand, has been cited for doing a wonderful job with broad differentiation. Best cost provider strategy is probably Target. Macy's might be on the high side of that, on the high side of best cost these days, and Target might be slightly on the lower side of best cost. Then we move down and we look at the focused low-cost strategy, and Sports Basement has been a great example of that one. I don't know, many of you may not know it, but it's a company out in California and on the West Coast that's actually focused on having sports products for mostly targeted towards younger people and at very low cost price. And then, of course, Victoria's Secret's actually got its beginning, and I think it's since moved on from this. It's actually now pursuing a broad differentiation strategy. But in the beginning, it was a focused differentiation strategy because it went after a narrow segment or niche of women who wanted a particular kind of lingerie, right? And who were willing to pay a premium for that lingerie. So in the beginning, it actually was pursuing a focused differentiation strategy. So there we have it, the 5 examples. Let's talk about each one in more detail. Let's start with low cost. So low cost, how do we find success pursuing low cost? Well, we have to make achievement of low cost, the theme of the firm. It's everything we do in the firm must be about bringing our costs down, and we must do that on a very standardized, regularized basis, right? And we include features and services in the product offering that are considered essential. We only include those that are considered essential. You think about an example of that is if you go to Walmart to buy some product, right? You walk into the store itself is bare bones, right? It's bare bones. It has shelving, basic shelving and racks and aisles and some basic lighting. But beyond that, you're not going to find much in the way of fancy furniture or fancy accessories or so forth in the store itself, right? It's very bare bones. It's the essentials that are needed to sell the kind of products they sell. Number 3 is that you've got to find an approach to achieving a cost advantage that is difficult for rivals to copy or match. And again, Walmart has done a great job at this. They did a lot of work back in the 80s and 90s in terms of perfecting their just-in-time ordering system. So their supply chain management systems are superior, and that has given them a long-term advantage over their direct rival Kmart. Over many years, it's given them a big advantage. And if you look to Capstone actually gives you this as an option. They actually call it broad cost leader, and I just want to make sure you understand how what we're talking about here in class maps over to Capstone. So if you look at Capstone, you see 12.1 broad cost leader, and they give you the definition that's very comparable to what we're talking about here. And there are 2 approaches to securing a cost advantage. How do I go about doing this? The first approach we call cost control. And cost control means that we try to do a better job than our rivals of every single activity in the value chain. We try to become more efficient, much more efficient at every aspect of the value chain than our rivals. And a great example of a company that's done that over the years has been Nucor Steel. And of course, in CapSim, we refer to this as automation. We try to automate and streamline how we do things in the business. The other way is what we call bypassing cost. And here's where we revamp the value chain to kind of eliminate some steps in the value chain. So we're not going to try to be better at every single step in the value chain, but rather we're going to try to re-engineer the value chain so we can eliminate some steps or processes. And that's exactly what Walmart did, and sometimes we call this process re-engineering. We figure out a way to eliminate some of the steps that have previously been necessary, and in doing so we can seize upon great cost savings there. So we have two ways that we can go about acquiring or achieving low cost, or some combination. Basically, we of course could do a combination. Now, there's a document up on Edgell under Learning Module Tools for Assessments, A2 Business Level Strategy Analysis, and then we call these Business Level Strategies. So the document is actually referred to as Business Level Strategies, and in there it will talk to you about for a particular strategy, when is it appropriate to use that strategy? When might this strategy make a lot of sense? So think about low cost. When does low cost seem to work best? It seems to work best when I look at the marketplace and I see a lot of price competition. So I see a lot of companies competing on price. So I know in that segment, if I want to go after those particular segments of the market, I'm probably going to have to compete on price. When product is basically standardized or readily available from many suppliers. So you think about toothpaste and toilet paper, the kind of things that Walmart is selling. It's pretty standardized. Most of us use them in a common way. You know, I use toothpaste as you do, right? There are a whole lot of variations for how we use toothpaste or toilet paper. And so in that sense, these are very standardized, almost commodity-like products that are being sold. And so because of that, we probably are going to have to compete on price. There are a few ways to achieve differentiation that would have value to the buyers. You know, I don't need gold-plated toilet paper that's delivered, that's positioned in a fancy room where I go to buy it. I don't need that. Most of us don't need that, right? So if you think about the kinds of products that Walmart is selling, there's very few ways to achieve, you know, differentiation that would be highly meaningful to buyers. Maybe a little bit, but not a whole lot, right? Most buyers use the product in the same ways. Yeah, I typically use toothpaste like you do, and so forth, right? Buyers incur low switching cost. Yeah, it doesn't take me much to switch from Kmart to Walmart to buy these kind of products. Now, do companies sometimes try to induce higher switching costs? Yeah. What has Kmart done to try to induce some higher switching costs? Well, they've given you a little membership plan, and you build points in the membership plan. So the more you buy from them, the greater the discounts you get from them, or you get perks and benefits. So they've tried to induce a little bit of switching costs, but you know, ultimately it's not that high. It's not that difficult to switch in this kind of retail space. Buyers are large and have significant buying power. Yeah, there's a lot of people buying. A lot of us, almost everybody in the country's out there buying, you know, toilet paper and toilet paper and toothpaste. So the kind of products that we'd find at Walmart. And also, if we look at the industry and see that newcomers are using low pricing to get into the market, we know that that's probably the kind of strategy that one has to pursue. And again, this document that details when to use a particular strategy option is up on Edgell, and it's called Business Level Strategies, and you can refer to that document. Now let's switch and talk about differentiation. And the objective with differentiation is really to incorporate those features, those bells and whistles that buyers that would cause a group of buyers to prefer your product over another brand's or another rival brand's offering. And of course, you would therefore charge more. So price, in a way, is lagging behind the product itself. So the product is highly differentiated, and we therefore charge a higher price for it. And what are the keys to success? Well, in using a differentiation strategy? Well, of course, it is finding a way to differentiate that creates values for the buyers, and it's not easily matched or cheaply copied by rivals. And of course, one of the caveats is that I cannot spend more as a company. The company cannot spend more on achieving the differentiation than they can charge for it in the marketplace. So if it cost me 10% more to further differentiate this product, but I can only charge 5% more for it, then I've got a problem, right? So I really always have to think about this idea that I can't differentiate more than I can charge for it. So really, indeed, I have to find a way to make sure the value matches what the marketplace is willing to pay for that particular incremental value. Very important. And in CAPSIM, we refer to this as the broad differentiator. Excuse me there. And what is the critical factor in differentiation? Well, differentiation requires that you have a theme of differentiation. You just can't say that I want to differentiate. You have to say in what particular ways are you going to differentiate. And so here are some examples of these broad differentiation themes. Well, one is unique taste. And Dr. Pepper years ago actually did a great job of charging a premium. They no longer do that. But when they were introduced, they did charge a premium because they were the ones that offered a kind of unique taste. And some people actually love that taste and some people hate it, actually, right? Environmental footprint. The Toyota Prius and Ford as well these days, they're selling us environmental footprint. They're selling us on the promise of reducing our environmental footprint. So they charge a premium. The Prius may save us money and reduce our environmental footprint, but we pay a premium to achieve that, right? We are willing to pay a premium to get that kind of product, and that's a form of differentiation. FedEx and Ritz-Carlton, they focus in on superior service. You're willing to pay a premium because you'll get it there tomorrow by 10 a.m., right? Guaranteed. Caterpillar, I think Caterpillar is a wonderful example where they differentiate by saying that, it isn't so much that the product is superior. It's a very good product, but we are going to make spare parts readily available for you in a very easy way. Now, why is that important? Think about if I'm using a Caterpillar, if I'm using a backhoe, if I'm a construction company and the part breaks, and these big pieces of heavy equipment do break, and it's kind of tough it's hard to make them absolutely indestructible. They're pretty indestructible, but to make them absolutely indestructible it's really not cost feasible. So nobody does that. So parts do break on them. So the point is to not make it unbreakable or unbreakable. It is rather than, if it does break, then are parts quickly, readily available? Why is that important to a construction company? Why would that be important? Well, construction companies, if their big construction equipment breaks down, then they incur big costs due to delays. And they actually have what we call liquidated damages they may have to pay. If the project isn't delivered on time, then they have to pay the owner damages, right? Because the owner may be losing, maybe incurring costs as well for not having the building available on the date that it was promised by. And so as a result of that, having spare parts readily available, quickly available is very important in this arena. So you're willing to pay, if you're a construction company, you may be willing to pay a premium for the particular equipment if you knew that you could indeed quickly get the spare parts. The next one is engineering, design, and performance, and I think BMW especially has wonderfully differentiated along this theme. Rolex pursues prestige, right? So they try to differentiate on prestige. Johnson & Johnson baby products, product reliability. This product is reliable, will not harm your little baby. And think about that. Are you willing to pay more for that baby powder so it doesn't harm your baby? So it doesn't choke your baby? I think you are, right? So product reliability may become very important. Quality manufacturing, that's Toyota's way of differentiating, generally speaking. And lastly is 3M. They differentiate along this theme of technological leadership. So the key lesson here is that it's not enough to say that you want to differentiate. You have to say how you're going to differentiate. And if I said to you Nordstrom's in differentiation, how does Nordstrom's differentiate from other high-end department stores? Well, they differentiate along the lines of customer service. They offer superior customer service and experience. And so that's how they differentiate. Now, it's also important to think not just about the product. And certainly I would want to start this process of differentiating by thinking about the product. But as we've already talked about with Caterpillar, it wasn't really so much about the product, but it was about a service that was associated with the product that actually formed a point of differentiation in the market. So we need to think about, beyond just the product. We need to think about the entire value chain. Where can I add differentiating value in this value chain? So I need to look at all the different activities, right? So I would want to go through this entire value chain. And of course, I might want to start by looking at purchasing and procurement activities. In the B2B space, I might add differentiating value and be able to charge a premium if I make it easier for the purchasing and procurement department to actually acquire our product and reorder the product. We might want to look at the actual product itself. How do we R&D it and design it? Of course, that's essential and that's core to any differentiating activity. We might want to look about how we produce it and how we make it, the kinds of technology we use to make it, because customers may want a product that actually was made in a particular way using certain processes, for example, that might reduce environmental footprint. I make this car in a certain way that has zero waste or zero landfill, and because of that, you're willing to pay a premium, for example. So it isn't so much about the product, but it's about how we made that product. Also, how do we distribute this? If I make it easier for you to acquire or get the product or go directly to you, if this is a B2C environment, if I go directly to you, you might be willing to pay a premium because you can get it directly from me and not have to go through a middleman or middle business or distribution business, right? And of course, how do we market it? How do we sell it and so forth? All of that factors in. And of course, thinking about how the buyer uses the product. Maybe I could do something at a service that would actually enhance how you use the product. So again, maybe it's not so much about the product, but it's about the service that gets coupled with the product. So think about the various steps of the value chain and where could we add value. It isn't always just about the product. Of course, a better product is a good place to start, but that in a particular marketplace, that may not be the way to differentiate. And this might be a good way to generate those themes. Think about where you could add value, differentiating value, and that might become your theme of differentiation. And some very common themes or approaches are number one would be to incorporate product features or attributes that lower the buyer's overall cost of using the product. Prius is a great example of that because you will pay more for the Prius because it reduces your environmental footprint, and that lowers your overall cost of operation or using the product, right? Two is incorporating features or attributes that raise the performance. So this is the classic one where we make the product a better product and we increase it in terms of its performance. And BMW, I think, BMWs are a fantastic example of that kind of differentiation. The third one is incorporating features and attributes that enhance buyers' satisfaction in non-economic or, intangible ways. I feel good about myself. So prestige because I own that particular object. And this is what Cadillac did traditionally is what they did. Now they've kind of shifted a bit over the years, and I think now they're more differentiating along the lines of performance, but historically they differentiated along the lines of this non-economic or intangible satisfaction, this idea that I'm a little bit superior because I actually have this product and others can see me with this product. Four would be to compete on the basis of superior capabilities, and the most common capability would be durability. So here it's not performance, but rather it is durability. You think about Honda and Acura, and Acura being a high-end car. Acura differentiates itself along the lines of durability. It's a more durable car, perhaps a little more stylish and a more durable car. So slightly more stylish Honda, essentially. And you're willing to pay more for that. So keep in mind, it's not always the product, but it actually differentiation can come from other places in the value chain. And lastly, when is a differentiation strategy appropriate? Well, it's basically where buyer needs and uses are diverse. And this goes to this idea of the long tail. And that is where you see demand for various forms of customization. So here, people don't want the same product. They actually want it varied and differentiated. They'd like it to be customized. We call this the long tail, right? And two is when there are few rivals are following a similar differentiation approach or a similar theme. So when you see lots of different themes of differentiation, that would suggest that there is possibilities for one to differentiate in the marketplace. And thirdly is where technological change and product innovation are fast-paced. So here, this is where we're in a fast-moving market. So if I look at the market and I see that product introductions are happening in a 2-year or less span, so let's say every year there's a new product variation that comes out, then that says to me that we probably have to pursue a differentiation strategy. So these are the keys that I would look for. If I looked at a particular market space, and if I saw these three activities or these three characteristics, I would say to myself, we really ought to be pursuing a differentiation strategy. Now, let's talk about best cost. Best cost is when we try to combine an emphasis on low cost and differentiation. So here we're trying to be masters of both differentiation and low cost and find that trade-off point or that balance point between the two. It is doable. Companies do it, but it is tough to do. And it sounds seductive because it sounds like we'll be all things to all people, but the truth is it is very difficult to operationalize this, to make this become a reality. It is very difficult to implement this sort of strategy. Not impossible, but very difficult to do. So here we're trying to find some way to deliver some superior value. So we're trying to deliver some superior value And at the same time, we're trying to lower the cost, right? So we want to bring this thing at a slightly lower cost, but have it, be a little bit differentiated as well. We're trying to figure out exactly in what ways can we differentiate and yet still bring the cost down, right? So it is difficult to balance between these two competing demands. They do pull it. These are two demands that tug at each other. So you think about Target and selling slightly more stylish furniture, but still at a reasonable cost. So it might be slightly more stylish than Walmart or Target, slightly better looking, but it may not be any better quality. So they may make it look a little more stylish, but it actually may be not very durable. And that's maybe how they find this trade-off point, right? So they essentially give it a little more style and they pay a little bit more for designing it, and they can charge a little bit more because of that, but it's still relatively cheap furniture. And because of that, they need to then, save somewhere, so they save on the actual quality of the construction of the furniture, right? It's an example how we might do this, but again, difficult to do. In CAPSIM, we have two variants of this. We have the cost leader with product lifestyle focus, and we have the differentiator with product lifestyle focus. So, you've got two variants of this that are possible. So CAPSIM kind of admits and says, yeah, it is possible to do best cost. But again, this takes a lot of coordination to make it happen, a lot of coordination. So we are trying to achieve competitive advantage by being able to combine higher quality with lower cost. And typically we would pick one of these four and choose one of these four as our point of differentiation, and then try to save on every other aspect. So we might try to incorporate some features that make it more attractive. So that's the better design. But then we would do lower quality, lower performance, and lower service, right? That's where we would save. So we'd spend a little bit more on features, but we would save on quality, performance, or service. Conversely, we could say we're going to make it a slightly better quality in terms of construction, make it a slightly better quality, but we're going to lower the features, lower the performance, and lower the service. Or we could say, well, let's make the performance of it slightly better, but we're going to lower the quality, the durability of it perhaps, the features, the design features, and the service associated with it. Or we could say, let's do slightly better on service, but have lower features, lower quality, lower performance. These tend to be the four variables that you'd play with. But again, you'd increase one and you'd lower the other three to kind of achieve some kind of cost savings, right? So again, you're dealing with trade-offs here, trade-offs. And where is a best cost provider strategy most appropriate? Where buyer diversity makes product differentiation the norm, and where many buyers are also sensitive to price and value. And we do find circumstances like that. So think about Target, Home Depot, JetBlue. JetBlue tries to pursue a best cost provider strategy. And they sometimes are a little bit more on the low cost side, and sometimes they vary a bit and they're a little bit more on the differentiated side, but they kind of move a bit. And they've actually not always had success with it. So, while Target has to some degree been successful pursuing a best cost strategy, JetBlue has vacillated a bit with it because I think they've found it difficult to implement or to bring to life, right? Panera Bread does a pretty good job of being a kind of a best cost provider. They give you a little bit of a slightly better experience on the service side than what you'd get at a McDonald's, but they're slightly more expensive, but they're still not, obviously not a high-end dining experience, right? So some examples of when to use best cost and those who have been successful. Now let's talk about our two niche options. Let's talk about focus low cost and focus differentiation. Focus, they both involve determining a niche to serve. That's the key here. So determining the niche becomes very, very important. And of course, you want to serve that niche better than anybody else, right? The idea here is that I'm going to either serve that niche better than anybody else on a cost basis or on a differentiation basis. So I need to determine. So the big thing is choosing this niche, choosing this market. And usually you want to do it where the needs are so special and so unique that the bigger players in the market typically don't care, because it incrementally doesn't make sense for them to pursue that niche. It's too small for them, right? and you have the possibility of developing the unique capabilities needed to serve the demands of that niche that nobody else seems to want to serve. And typically you're going to be a smaller player. Not always, but typically it is smaller players who go after these niches because bigger players don't find them very economically feasible. The customization needed may not be economically feasible, and so they therefore typically don't pursue these niches, right? So what are the niche, how do I approach it? Well, how do I approach defining the niche market? Well, there are a few basic ways. The first, the one that's most common is geographic uniqueness. And airlines is a good example of this. So in the beginning, Southwest pursued this. They focused in on a couple major lines. I think they were flying from Dallas to Chicago, I believe it was, or it was Houston, Chicago, one of those major Texan cities to Chicago. And on that particular line, they made sure that they were the lowest cost provider. And so they were, in the beginning, they were very much pursuing a focused low cost strategy. So geographical uniqueness is one way to do that. Specialized requirements in using the product or service. And Nextel was a great example of this. They were the ones who kind of came out with the walkie-talkie phones. I don't know if anybody remembers that. And they were useful in the construction industry because in the old days, airtime was very expensive. I know today we have these unlimited plans and it's very inexpensive to use your cell phone to call somebody because you have unlimited minutes. But in the old days, you had to pay by the minute. It was very expensive. And if I run a construction site, I was probably, and working with the team, I might be just far enough away from the other person that we couldn't just shout easily and communicate. So we needed some means for communicating. And so and we didn't probably want to call them because we'd use up those expensive minutes, right? So the walkie-talkie feature made a lot of sense. It satisfied the needs of this particular niche for a period of time. But of course, over time, that niche eroded because as the cost of airtime came down, then of course the demand for this kind of product kind of went away. You know, why do I need to use a walkie-talkie now when I can just call you because I have unlimited minutes, right? The third way is specialized product attributes that would appeal only to the niche buyer. And so think about Sports Basement. They actually provide a particular kind of sports clothing that targeted men 16 to 22 that older guys maybe wouldn't want to wear because maybe they wouldn't flatter older guys' bodies or they'd be uncomfortable or whatever. But that would appeal to young guys. So it's a certain kind of appeal that would only be found with a particular market. So you'd understand that market and you know what a particular kind of product or a range of products that would appeal to that market. And in CapSim, we've got the niche differentiator or the niche cost leader, right? The high-tech one or the low-tech one. And to achieve a competitive advantage with focused low cost is essentially means to, basically have the lowest cost possible than your rivals. And again, Southwest did a wonderful job with that in the beginning. Or to say we're going to differentiate and do a better job than our rivals do with that particular segment, that particular niche. Southwest, as I said, was a wonderful example of focused low-cost strategy in the beginning. Now, they have since shifted up to a broad low-cost strategy, or just essentially a low-cost strategy that appeals to everybody because they now serve many, many markets. Another example would be 101 Inks. They're a company online, and all they do is sell inks at a very, very cheap cost, or they used to anyway. I haven't checked on them lately, but I assume they're still kind of playing to that niche. In terms of focused differentiation strategy, well, Tesla electric cars, fantastic example of a focused differentiation strategy. There's a small niche market that wants this very high-end performance electric car and are willing to pay a lot of money for them. Right? Conversely, an ethnic grocer is actually pursuing a focused differentiation strategy. There may not be a lot of people that want a particular type of ethnic ingredients or ethnic food products, but when they are, they're usually willing to pay a slight premium for that, right? So if you think about an ethnic grocer in a big city on the corner there, you go to that grocer, often you'll pay more for the products there, but that's because maybe you can't find them in the mainstream big supermarkets, right? You might find a little bit of that in a Safeway or in a Kroger, so forth. But typically, those big supermarkets don't find it profitable to carry a whole lot of those ethnic groceries, so they tend not to, right? So here's some examples of when it would make sense, right?
So I hope that was useful. Now I want to move into part B and get into the business modeling aspects. And I'm going to try to answer these questions. What are business models? After developing a concept, how might one go about creating a business model? So we're going to go through all the classic components of a business model so that you understand what the expectations are for a complete, comprehensive, and robust business model. And then at the very end, we'll wrap up with some discussion around sustainability and what we call the triple bottom line. So what is a business model? You might ask that question. And according to our book, a business model describes the rationale of how an organization creates, delivers, and captures value. And when we talk about value, we often mean this connection between something somebody needs and usually money in exchange for that. And so value resides in those two coming together. Value is both what I give to somebody else and what I get in return for that. That exchange or that transaction represents the value to all parties involved. Now, another way to define this is to speak about concerning yourself with whether revenues and costs flowing from the strategy demonstrate a business can be profitable, viable, and sustainable. So here, think about it this way. The business model actually looks at what are the revenues coming into the firm, cash flowing in, and what are the costs or expenses flowing out? And do the revenues exceed the costs to the point that we can be viable as an organization and sustainable? And some of you might say, well, I want to do a nonprofit, so this doesn't apply. But that's actually not correct. It does apply. Nonprofits do create a value, but the money they get in exchange for the value comes from a different party. So they actually have two customers always. They have the customer that they are supporting with their value, but then the income comes from a separate group of people, often referred to as foundations or funders. So somebody else gives them the money because somebody wants to see some kind of positive social impact for another group. So indeed, their business model does look at revenues too, but the revenues are not coming directly from the customer they directly serve. Rather, it's coming from a different group of people that actually have the money but don't want to do the value creation themselves, but are willing to pay for the value creation to happen. Now, what's important about a business model is that the business model becomes the foundation for the business plan, and that plan enables us to pitch for funding. It enables us to go out and to speak to others who might have funding, and those would be people who would like to invest in either the private company or in the nonprofit. So either way, we need a business plan, and that business model creation is essential because the business model then becomes the foundation for creating the robust business plan. So I like our book because our book is visual. It helps us to visually quickly understand all the components. And the book does give us 9 components, and those are customer segments, value propositions, channels, customer relationships, revenue streams, key resources, key activities, key partnerships, and cost structures, right? And so I'm going to go through each one of these in more detail. But before I do that, let's look at how the book visualizes all of this for us. You can look at the image on the screen now in front of you, and you'll see that it's all of these 9 building blocks. They're all there, but they're kind of they're arranged in a way where the interconnectedness between them or among them kind of show or are visible. And I think that's kind of cool. And one of the reasons why I like this book so much is that at a glance, you kind of get it. Like, here's my organization, and here's all the key things that my organization needs to do to be viable, to be sustainable. And if you look at it on the left side of the screen, most of the activities there speak to your internal operational efficiencies, right? We've got the key activities, we've got the key partners, the key resources needed, and the cost structure. And those really are issues that relate to how we operate internally and how we produce efficiencies. And if you look to the right, we have value development, and that is What do we push out into the market, and how do we get it out into the market, and who are those customers, and how do we embrace them, and how do we collect income from putting that value out into the marketplace. And again, if you participated at ICNY and you go back to our who, why, what cards, this side of the house, the value development side of the house, really builds upon what you do when you're ideating. You talked about who you should serve, and of course that speaks to your customer segments. You talked about why we should serve them, and that speaks to the value proposition, as well as the channels. And lastly, you frame the problem or opportunity that they face, and the value proposition has to squarely answer that, develop that. So then you used the who, why, what card information to craft a design statement. So you would then understand what the problem really deeply was, and that gave you a lot of guidance for developing your concept or idea. So we went through ideation, and you developed this wonderful new concept or idea. But the problem there was that we stopped. We didn't go on and develop it. The business model enables you to go on and develop this and make it become a reality. And the operating side of the house is where you fabricate or make concrete or real this idea, so it then can be then delivered or given to somebody else, the who that we talked about. Now let's start to talk about each one of those 9 building blocks so that you better understand them, so that you can then craft a business model for your particular organization. So the first one is customer segments, and this is so important, and it just goes right back to the who, why, what card. The who is so important because without the who, we really don't have a reason for having the organization. So we really have to understand who the customers are. They are the heart of any business model. So that's why we begin here. That's why they are number one. And, the business model helps us to understand who they are, and then we build around that so we can deliver value out to them. And when we start to create segments or these groups or clusters of customers, some of the things that we need to think about is how to determine when does a segment become a segment independent of other segments, right? And so the book gives us some advice about that. So here's some tips that the book gives us. It says, you create a separate group or separate segment when their needs require justify a distinct offer. So the moment a particular group needs something different than another group, you make them 2 separate groups. You reach them. Perhaps you need to reach them through a different distribution channel. They may require a different type of relationship. So if everybody requires the same relationship, they belong in the same segment, right? But if they require a different relationship, then you may need to segment them. They have substantially different profitabilities. That may require you to segment them out, because then you may have to modify how you make the value for them or the product for them. If somebody's giving you less profit, then you may have to make a cheaper version of it, right? So you may need to segment them out. And lastly, they are willing to pay for different aspects of the offer. So some may be wanting to emphasize a particular aspect of the value or the product that you're offering, and they're willing to pay a premium for that, and you might want to segment them out for that reason. So that's some of the tips we have in terms of segmenting and these particular customer groups. And what are some other consideration? Well, are you reaching out to businesses or consumers? How you reach out really hinges upon whether this is a B2B play or a B2C play, right? Are you a business going to a consumer, or are you a business going to another business, selling to another business? Another consideration is that, are you selling to a mass market, or are you pursuing a niche market? If I look at Walmart, pretty much everybody buys something from Walmart. So clearly they're pursuing a mass market, and that requires one kind of focus of the organization, versus if you're going after a particular niche, right? If you're going after if you're a specialty retailer who sells sportswear to young guys, that's completely different. That's a niche market, and that's completely different than selling products and services to just about everybody in the country, mass market. So you need to make sure you understand, are we going to a mass market or a niche market? And if we are going to a niche market, how do we define that niche market or those niche markets? Segmented, speaks to what we just talked about, and often we may find that within a particular group, we have to segment it, right? There may be, within the same group, there may be subtle differences. And the book, I think, mentions the example of high-end banking customers versus regular banking customers. They're all banking customers who need a certain amount of wealth management, but some who have a lot of wealth, a whole lot of wealth, may need different services than those who have just an average amount of wealth. And then lastly, there's this notion of diversified versus multi-sided. Sometimes we have different segments, so we're not quite mass market, but we've got different segments, and these different segments aren't really related directly to each other, other than the fact that they're buying something from us. And that we would call that diversified, especially if they're kind of very different segments. Then what we have is what we call multi-sided, and that is when there's two or more segments that we are linked together, right? It could be that we're selling both to businesses and to consumers, and what we sell to the business may then be connected to what we sell to the consumer. And so it's called multi-sided when there is a direct connection between those segments. When there's no connection, we call that diversified, highly diversified. And for risk management from a company perspective, usually diversified enables us to kind of lower our risk, right, for multiple reasons that we're not going to go into today. Whereas multi-sided might give us more risk, but it actually might enable us, multi-sided might enable us to generate greater efficiencies as an organization, and therefore we might reap greater profit. Of course, there might be greater risk, but greater profit. So next we want to talk about number 2, which is value propositions. And that is really, really fundamental. What kind of value are we giving out to our customer? What kind of value are we giving? And that basically speaks to the package of the product and or services together, right? We're giving that like a basket of goodies, a gift out to them. And the degree to which we develop high value for the customer will then determine some of what we get in exchange, right? A little bit later, we're going to talk about the revenues that we get back in, and they will hinge upon this beautiful little gift, this beautiful box that we then deliver out to the customer segments, right? And it is the products or services that we put together. And some considerations, we'd want to think about this. Are we providing a low-cost solution or a highly differentiated solution for this customer? Walmart, for the most part, provides low-cost solutions. It's, bare bones. When you walk into that store, you're not getting a whole lot of service there, correct? But you're paying less, and in exchange for paying less, you're getting less service. Or does the customer segment want something that's highly differentiated with lots of bells and whistles? And if they do, they're usually willing to pay more, pay a premium for that. So going to Macy's is a different experience than going to Walmart. Getting a BMW car is a different experience than getting a Chevrolet car, right? So we need to think about the value proposition. Is the core essence of our value proposition that we're providing some minimum value for low cost to that consumer? Or is it that we're providing a lot of robustness, a lot of differentiation, a lot of bells and whistles, a luxurious package, and we're therefore charging a premium for it? And we need to understand that. That's very fundamental. Some other considerations include newness. How novel is the idea or the value that we're providing? And if it's highly novel, we probably are differentiating ourselves from what's been offered, and we can usually charge a premium because the customer segments that want that are willing to pay a lot of money for that typically. Performance. Is this high performance or low performance? Is this a high performance BMW or Tesla, or is it a basic Chevrolet? And again, that goes back to how much you can charge. Right? Is there a high degree of customization? Are we able to customize? And if we are customizing, how do we do that customization? And customization is really important to particular customer groups. And if we do provide a high degree of customization, then we can usually charge a premium, right? The next one is getting the job done. And we often can provide services that help a particular segment get their work done. So it's more of the service to them that matters. Design may matter. And we think of Apple for this, right? Apple gives people incredibly designed, beautifully designed products that are easy to use. And usually customers are willing to pay a premium for that nicer design. The next one is brand and status. And customers that seek brand status through the particular offering or value proposition typically, again, are willing to pay a higher price. Of course, in the value proposition, we have to think about the price that we're setting. Are we setting a low-cost price or is it a high price? And usually if it is a high price, as I think is obvious by now, you're going to have to provide a fair degree of differentiation through newness, performance, customization, service, and design, right? And brand status. You're going to have to provide a high degree of differentiation, and therefore you'll be able to charge that higher price. Next, this is cost reduction is, am I providing you value? Am I providing a customer segment value that may not be cheap? They may have to pay a premium, but it helps them reduce their cost of operation. It helps them to reduce their cost of operation. And one of the examples that we've always thought about historically was, Caterpillar was offering their customers this idea. Think about who buys Caterpillar. Often it's construction companies, and Caterpillar offered them a package of services, a one-day turnaround if a part were to break, and customers were willing to pay a premium for that service, get the job done service, because it enabled them to reduce their cost. Because their costs would go up if they had delays. So if I'm out at a job site if I'm constructing a new building and my heavy piece of Caterpillar equipment breaks, if I can't get that repaired right away, I will have delays, and those delays will cost me. And so by having this immediate turnaround, it enables me to reduce my cost, and I'm willing to pay a premium to get that immediate turnaround, which then reduces my cost. Also, I'm willing to pay a premium if I'm going to get a risk reduction. And again, this may be a form of risk reduction. Caterpillar offering this service, Caterpillar to construction companies or general contractors. It was a cost reduction and it was a risk reduction as well. The next point of consideration is accessibility. Is what you're providing in terms of value out to the customer not something that's new, not something that's unique, but it's something that a particular segment didn't have access to before? That's a value. There may be particular groups or segments of customers who didn't have access previously to what you're offering. Maybe this is something, 3D printers at some time in history were only available to very high-end businesses. 3D printers were very expensive. And then along came a group of folks who said, you know what? We're going to find a way to make 3D printers available to everyday consumers. And so that shifted accessibility. So it wasn't about the concept of the 3D printer so much. That had existed, but all of a sudden now others, through reworking and reconfiguring and finding a way to streamline the package and reduce it in a certain way, it was now accessible to consumers in a way that it had not been accessible previously, right? So accessibility can be a key part of your value package, right? And the last one is, and this speaks to something similar, and it's convenience and usability. How convenient or usable is this for me? And so what you may offer a particular customer segment, the value you may offer may be in the heightened convenience and usability of the product. You make it easier for them to access it and use it, and it's more convenient therefore, and as a result, they're willing to pay you money for that. That's of value to them. So those are our considerations for value propositions. Now let's go on and talk about number three, channels. And channels are really, how do our potential targeted segments or the people that we've targeted for this, how do they get access to the value that we're proposing? And so, and this is kind of interesting because there are many different ways we can do that, and there are many different aspects of channels. So, you know, channels help us to raise awareness among customers about this value that we're providing, these products and or services, correct? So without the channels, customers may not be aware of the value that we're providing. And next is it helps them to evaluate our value propositions, helps them to evaluate the value. The channel can be very, very important for that. And it may allow them to purchase the products and services. It helps us to deliver. Channels can help us to deliver the product out to those particular customers. And lastly, it can help us to provide post-purchase customer support, right? It may be that customers need support after they bought whatever it is we're selling to them. And so, you know, our considerations are awareness, evaluation, purchase, delivery, and after-sales service or, you know, support. And one only need to think about cars, right? You know, we become aware of cars through multiple channels, through advertising, through dealerships, and so forth. We're able to make evaluations through various channels. I can go to Consumer Reports. That can help me make evaluations. Also, advertising can help me make evaluation. But also, I can go to the dealership directly and test drive the car and make evaluations that way. Now I can also look at what other consumers are posting on certain websites and saying about the car, and that can help me to make evaluations. Next is purchase. And traditionally, I really purchased them through one channel only, and those channels were dealerships, correct? Dealerships. And then next was delivery. I always traditionally took delivery through the dealership. So that was the key channel for me getting my car, was to get delivery that way. And for a new car, now for a used car, delivery is different, a little bit different, right? I might go directly to the consumer to get the used car. And then lastly, we all know that cars traditionally, especially ICEs or internal combustion engines, actually needed service, a lot of servicing. So after-sales support was important, and I would go to the dealership for that as well. So the dealership as a channel served importance in terms of awareness, evaluation, purchase, delivery, and after-sales service, correct? Now, let's think about Tesla and these fully electric cars. So we move from, you know, electric vehicles away from ICEs or internal combustion engines through Tesla. And as you may know, Tesla doesn't use dealerships. And you may say to yourself, well, why did they rethink this delivery channel and their business model? I think it's a wonderful case for us to kind of contemplate business models for channels for a while in terms of as a building block for business models. And it was interesting because they realized that electric cars require far less back-end or after-sales service. They just require far less service. So do we really need a dealer network? Dealer networks are expensive. And if we can eliminate that channel and use other channels for awareness, evaluation, purchase, and delivery, could we save a lot of money? And that would make it easier for us to achieve profitability through the price that we would charge for the car, right? So kind of brilliant. They realized they were able, for the most part, to eliminate dealers on the back end and go direct to consumers, and therefore they do a direct delivery model, right? So you purchase directly from them on their website. If you think about historically, when the traditional dealership channels arose, it was in a day and time when there was no such thing as internet. There was absolutely no such thing as internet, and advertising for awareness was still very limited in those days. In the early days of cars, we mostly had just print medium. Radio was just beginning, so maybe you could get some awareness through radio, but you mostly had print. So the only way you could get evaluation, purchase, and delivery and after-sales support was through a dealer network. So it was really only possible. But fast forward to today, when Tesla emerged, and Tesla really only emerged after the internet made easy information access very easy and low cost, and purchasing, transactions became very easy on the internet as well. So because of that, when Tesla developed, they said, hey, we don't need to have a traditional dealer network. We can get by with, we can do awareness, evaluation, purchase, delivery, and a little bit of after-sales service. I mean, electric cars do need some service, but they need so far less that we don't need the expense of having a complete dealer network as a channel for reaching and supporting customers, embracing customers. So they chose to use the internet and other means for awareness, evaluation, purchase, delivery, and after-sales service. Very interesting. So now let's talk about customer relationships, right? Customer relationships, very important. I mean, this is the big heart up on the screen, right? And when we think about customer relationships, we think about, acquiring customers. How do we reach out and acquire those customers? What do we do to retain them? And then lastly, how do we upsell or get more sales out of those customers? How do we, over time, have a relationship that enables us to refine the value that we offer to them and better embrace them? Because the world is dynamic and their needs and their wherewithal is shifting and changing. And so how do we stay in touch with them so that we can continue to upsell and get more, provide them with more value and get more revenue in exchange for doing that, right? So we gotta, develop these relationships so that we're out there acquiring new ones. We're retaining them. We've got to keep them happy with the value. And that means changing and evolving the value over time as well. And if we're going to get more sales from them, we need to think about maybe new products and services that they might like to get from us. So we've got to stay close to them. And what are some of the considerations that we might want to think about when formulating a plan for the actual relationship that we're going to provide, or relationships that will provide the various customers and or customer segments? It goes back to segments. We're always providing value to segments. And if we have multiple segments, we may have to think about acquisition, retention, and sales, upselling in terms of each one of those segments, correct? But so some considerations we might have is, how personal is the assistance we're providing our customers, right? How personal. So, and that means how much human interaction do they need versus interaction through other means such as the internet and just advertising? Do they need robust personal assistance, or can it be kind of lean and therefore handled mostly through advertising and email and these kind of more thin, medium, or more thin, I would call them thin, less robust ways of reaching out to them? And so if they need a lot of human assistance, if you are buying certain products, you certainly probably do need a lot of personal assistance. And I know Apple has done a great job with their Genius bars, right? They give you a lot of personal assistance. They give you a lot of personal assistance because they know for certain segments of technology buyers that those segments of technology buyers need a lot of personal assistance. They need a lot of hand holding, and having the Genius bar and having the actual physical store. So the store is a distribution channel, but that then enables them to have a high degree of a personal assistance. And you see how the two work together? And that's why those arrows on the screen are coming both at the customer. They can support, they're not, we think of them discreetly, but they can actually be multi-servicing for you, right? Having the store can enable you to sell directly, but it can also enable you to give this personal level of assistance that you couldn't give otherwise. Dell, on the other hand, decided that they don't need a high degree of personal assistance, so they're happy just to have a website to reach out and build relationships and sell through, right? So they mostly sell through websites, or have historically, and the website enabled them to and give customers a high degree of customization. If you go back to the previous screen, right? If you go back to channel, so to enable customization, but because they didn't need a high degree of personal assistance, they didn't have stores, right? Didn't have stores because we didn't need that high degree of personal assistance. Apple, on the other hand, said, you know what, the segments we're going after, they are technically less savvy, and they place a premium on design, and they place a premium on holding the hand or having their hands held, being directly guided. So personal assistance, very important. Sometimes customer groups need dedicated personal assistance. And, think about these very affluent, movie stars out in California, and they have personal shoppers for them, right? That work just for them and go out and do all their shopping, whether it be clothing, food, and so forth. And that's a particular niche segment that needs dedicated personal assistance, right? Dedicated personal assistance. Self-service. Do the customers want a self-service? And, if I think about Dell and how they reached out to customers through their websites, they allow you to self-service. Dell says, our customers have some tech savvy. They can pick and choose their own processors and their own screens and their own XYZ component to the computer. They can self-service. So we're going to enable them through the website to self-service, correct? Automated services. Do we want to enable our customers just to automatically get packages from us because most of what they're getting is kind of going to be very similar, and we just want these services to be automated? Do we need communities? Do we want to create a community around our product or service? And if so, how do we go about creating the community? And lastly, do we want to engage in co-creation? Maybe the way that we embrace changing the product for the customer is to co-create a community where they actually help design and redesign the value proposition for us. So they actually get engaged in doing that. And if you think about like Kickstarter and small businesses that kind of are entrepreneurial ventures that start through Kickstarter, they actually are allowing the community to co-create and co-develop with them, right? Amazon as well. Amazon allows you to give a lot of feedback and recommendations. So that's a way of co-creating the value and evolving the value over time. So these are all the things you want to think about when you're addressing both channels and the kind of relationship you want to have. And I always think of channels and customer relationships as working together. We show them discreetly because you do need to think about them discreetly, but then actually you want to meld them together holistically and see how they can work together and support. Both of those have to work well together to effectively get the value out to that particular customer that you want to reach. And next, of course, we need to think about revenue streams. We want to think about revenue streams, and very important building block because without revenue streams, we really don't have a viable organization or viable business, and it certainly won't be sustainable over the long haul if we don't have those revenue streams. And if we're not effective at packaging the value, getting it through the channel out to the customer, and embracing a relationship with the customer, if we're not effective at doing that, we certainly won't get the cash register there in yellow on the screen. It won't be clicking enough to actually then cover all the expenses that we're going to talk about in a moment. In a moment, we're going to switch over to the left side of the house, and we're going to talk about, the efficiencies of the organization and how we create the value, or how we make the value for the customer. But if we don't get enough of these revenues flowing in, money from the customers and or from funders or others, if we don't get enough money flowing in, we're not going to be able to cover those expenses. And we all know that. And this is really another aspect of the heart of the of this plan that you're crafting, or of this building model, which leads you into your business plan. And of course, some of the things we want to think about is our, pricing mechanisms, right? And we really need to think about, at the heart of the business model, we think about different types of revenue streams, and we think about, one-time purchases. Are we going after a lot of one-time purchases, or do we go after recurring, ongoing payments that are kind of involving a lot of post-purchase customer support, right? Are we going after continuous streams of revenue, or are we going after individual transactions? Individual transactions often relate from one kind of relationship and channel arrangement versus continuous streams that then say that we have more of a continuous streams really do then dictate that we have much more robust, stronger relationships and channel connections to our customers, correct? And certainly if we're going after post-customer support, we're going to have better channels of reaching out to them. So again, all of these items are interrelated. We're talking about them discretely. All the building blocks are discrete, but they ultimately do fit together holistically and have to work together if we're going to support and go after that customer and be effective in supporting and going after that customer. And some of our considerations are we a for-profit or a not-for-profit? If we're for-profit, we know that revenue has to come from those segments that we are directly serving through our value, our relationships, and our channels, correct? If we're a not-for-profit, now we know that we really have, broadly speaking, two types of customers. We have a customer that gets the direct value, and then we have a customer that gets the indirect value and gives us the money. We might be servicing, our model, if we're not for profit, our model of value might be to feed starving babies. We may be providing families that are socioeconomically challenged with food to feed newborn babies. That might be what our goal is. And so that's the customer we're directly servicing. But then there may be a foundation that cares about families and babies surviving and health issues relating from malnourishment. And they may be willing to give us money if we do a good job of getting this food out to these starving babies. And so we have to go after them as well, right? So we have our value. So we actually have a not-for-profit probably has at least two customer segments. The one that they service directly and reach out to directly and don't get revenue back from. And then the other one that they promote what they do to, so that, you've got to have a way, they will have to have a relationship with both segments. They will have to have a channel for both segments, and they have to have a value proposition for both segments, correct? The value proposition for the funder segment is going to differ from that of the actual direct customer segment, but it still needs to be there, right? It still needs to be there, and you still have to reach out to them. If you don't have a plan for reaching out to your funders, of course you won't get the revenue to the organization. So now let's move on and talk about asset sale, the different types. So asset sale refers to you getting revenue for selling a physical product. And that means that all the rights go along with the product. So once the customer owns it, they own everything about it. And it's usually physical. Could be a service as well, but it's usually physical. The next type is a usage fee. So perhaps you're charging a fee for using something on a temporal basis. And so, a hotel charges customers for how many nights they stay in the hotel. So you don't buy the hotel, you buy the usage of the hotel for a period of time. The next one is subscription fee. You could get money that way. And we all know subscription fees. The monthly fee you pay to the gym to attend the gym. The fee that you pay for the newspaper that comes every week and so forth, or a magazine, right? Classic subscription fees. The next one is lending, renting, leasing, and we all know that. You could lease a car instead of having an asset sale where you buy, as a customer, buy the entire car. You could lease the car. That means you return it to the manufacturer, the producer at the end of the lease period. Renting an apartment versus buying a house, right? The next one is licensing, and licensing means that you're basically paying a fee for the intellectual property. So you may pay a fee for how many units you produce using a patent, for example. So so it's a little bit different, but it's a specific, you can think of it as a specific type of leasing, essentially. Next, we have brokerage fees, and that's really about a service. And real estate agencies do this. They charge X amount because they intermediate between owners of houses, which are sellers and buyers of houses, correct? And so they charge a fee for doing that. So it's a service they provide. Next, we have advertising. And what's interesting about advertising is that, sometimes we go to websites and get information. So a lot of news sites have switched from being subscription like the traditional newspapers, and they've gone to this advertising model where you go there and get free information, and to you it looks free, but actually you're looking at ads as well, and your eyeballs looking at those ads are paying the fee that way. So it's the actual advertisers that are paying, and it's like a commercial TV effectively. Commercial TV seemed free to us, but we were actually paying the price by watching all those commercials and allowing ourselves to be influenced by those commercials. And of course, we always need to think about our pricing mechanisms when it comes to revenues. Are we doing fixed pricing or dynamic pricing? And the easiest way to think about that is, traditionally when you would go to a restaurant, most items on the menu were fixed, but however, the fish portion of the menu was not fixed typically. It was, priced daily because fish could fluctuate wildly depending on time of year and other conditions. So you always have to think about, are we doing dynamic pricing where we have to shift it, where it's negotiated, and it can vary, maybe it varies depending on the scale of quantity and so forth, or is it just fixed and given, And with cars, for example, there is a fixed price, but you can negotiate for the car, right? So it actually ends up being dynamic. So, and the book tells you more about that, and you can learn more about it if you need to. So that's revenue streams, right? You have to consider whether you're for-profit or not-profit, and then go through and think about what are we actually selling in terms of the value, and how should we collect money for that exchange of value. Next, number 6 is key resources, and every organization needs resources. Now we're shifting over to the left half of the organization, and that is really the internal operations of the organization. And it really is about the processes of leading the organization as well as, making the things that we make. We have to somehow produce this value, and how are we going to do that, right? How are we going to do that? And certainly we need resources to produce the value that we want to push out to the customer, right? That we want to deliver to the customer. So we have to have resources, and resources are usually in the form of physical objects and items that we need. So we may need buildings, we may need equipment, we may need furniture and so forth, right? So what are all the physical items that we may need? Hardware, computers, correct? So we need physical objects. We typically need intellectual assets as well, intellectual resources. And here we're talking about, patents and copyrights. We may need access to that, and partnerships. We'll need access to those kinds of things so that we can operate. We may need software, right? We may pay licensing fees for software to operate. We may need ERP systems, and we may need just desktop software as well, correct? So what kinds of intellectual property do we need, or intellectual resources? Certainly we need human resources. I've yet to know of any firm that 100% operates without humans involved, right? And humans then get organized into the various departments and competencies areas of the firms, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then we need financial assets. We need cold hard cash. We need debt. We need investors. So we need financial instruments, financial resources to operate. And again, that's why you're doing the business plan that will then lead you into a business model that will lead you into the business plan, because you need to go out there and find those financial resources to at least establish the firm and then sustain it over time as well. And then we have our key activities of the firm, key activities. And these are the processes by which we will lead and direct the firm, and then make what we make, or produce what we make, and push it out to the customer, get it out to the customer, right? And this is one point where I differ with the book. The book seems to only focus in on operational aspects of activities, and to me there's much more, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. So I want to make sure that you're aware that I think the book's a little bit deficient here in terms of key activities. I don't think they describe everything that is key, actually, right? So, but key activities are how we take those key resources and use them, deploy them through processes to actually, make what we are making in terms of the product or service, as well as leading and directing ourselves. The overall organization needs to be led and directed, and kind of needs to reinvent itself over time. And again, that's where the book falls short, but I'm going to help you with that. So in a moment, I'm going to walk you through governance and leading processes, because the book doesn't address that. But the book does address managing and operational processes, and they focus in on production. And yes, we need to produce, we need to design and make and deliver the products and or the services that we want to make. And we have to do them in quantities that are sufficient to satisfy the customers, right? And for us to generate revenue sufficient to sustain the organization. And of course, all of that involves problem solving, because problems do come up when we're doing these, operational processes on a daily basis. People don't show up to work, equipment breaks and so forth. Something in the market shifts, something's dynamic. A competitor makes a change, and we have to change and problem solve as a result of that. So we do need to have problem solving available to us and possible. And the last consideration before I go talk about governance and leading is basically platform and network. And this really speaks to this notion that, are you developing and putting out there a platform? Google has Android as a platform for many different phone carriers and hardware providers to use. And so if you are, how do you manage and update and keep that platform relevant? So it becomes a key part of your business model and your processes, right? If I have Android gets updated every few weeks, I don't know the actual schedule, but it gets updated. So I have to build that into my operational processes. How am I going to keep updating that? And those updates go out to the end users of the platform, but also those who are using it for the hardware as well. The suppliers or the producers that are using it, they need updates as well. So it's a complicated process, and you need to figure that out, and that needs to become a part of your key activities. Now, let's talk about governance and leading. And every organization, you see the little image up there on the up on the screen now, the little house. And that's my symbol for an organization. Every organization needs to govern and lead itself, right? So key activity is actually engaging in governance and leading. You need to make sure that you're managing all of these business plan components, or these, business model components, so that it all works together. And you need to keep evolving the firm so that it stays aligned with the needs of the marketplace and the dynamic qualities of the marketplace. The marketplace is shifting. Today, when you start, the customers want something a certain way, but over time that will shift. And how do we, who are leading the firm, what kind of processes do we have to make sure that the firm acts together and stays together, but also then we shift and change it as needed so that it meets those evolving needs of the marketplace, right? So governance and leading processes are very essential, and you need to think about those as key activities for the firm. Setting policy for the firm so that it all operates together, so that that business model that you're sketching out all works together and stays together, and then changes over time, leading it so that it changes over time and stays congruent with the shifting marketplace. And of course, under that we have what we referred to historically as pattern. We also call that culture. We need to set a culture for the firm. What kind of culture? What kind of firm? How are we going to behave within the firm? So again, this kind of goes across all of these business model components. How are we going to behave? What kind of attitude do the employees have towards each others and towards customers, right? Structure. How do we organize the people? We usually talk about organizing them by competencies. The marketing people set in one area, work together. The finance people set in another area, work together. But, how do we structure the organization? Who's in charge of what? And we refer to that as, kind of arranging the pattern. And it is about giving authority and power to various people within the organization. What level of authority do they have? To whom do they report? And so forth. Those are what we refer to as structuring the firm. And you need to think about that as a key activity, especially when you're starting the firm up, right? And then, of course, below that, we have managing the managing and operational processes or process. And we talked about that already a moment ago, right? And the book does a great job of talking about the key activities involved with managing and operating the firm, but it doesn't address these other parts that are above it. They're kind of assumed, I guess. And then, if you go back to your human resources, right? If you go back to item 6, where we talked about key resources, you need to structure and organize them typically by competencies, right? And those competencies are impacted by your governance and leading processes, by your pattern, structure, and of course by your operational processes as well. And you need to think about that. So what kind of departments do I need in my firm? What do I have a marketing? I could have marketing within the firm because maybe that's really essential. But in a moment, we're going to talk about partnerships outside the firm. And maybe marketing is best served by being outside the firm because maybe it's not so essential for us. Therefore, and it's cheaper for us to go outside the firm and outsource that and do it through a partnership. So you need to think about what activities belong in the firm and which ones belong outside the firm. Which competencies, and we usually think of them as competencies, marketing, finance, general management, production, manufacturing, and so distribution, and so forth, right? So, historically, car companies put distribution outside. Ford didn't own the dealerships. They had partnerships with networks and chains of dealerships, and that functioned well for them. And we mentioned that a moment ago. But today, Tesla's saying, you know what? Distribution belongs inside the firm. So they moved that competency inside their firm. Right? So that's a little bit different. So these are all decisions we can make when we're constructing the business model. And when we're dealing with this side of the house, the left side of the house, we want to think about efficiencies. Now let's talk about those key partnerships, right? Talk about those key partnerships. And often when we're talking about partnerships, what I think is most important to consider is what is essential for your competitive advantage as a firm? What is essential for anything that's essential for your competitive advantage, you'd like to make sure that's inside the firm because you need to control that. And you may want to keep that a bit secret. That may be something that's essential for your competitive advantage. And that may mean that you don't want others to know about it. Things that are not essential for the competitive advantage can be pushed outside the firm, especially if they're cheaper that way. If it's cheaper for you to use an outside marketing firm, the marketing's not essential for what you do, you'd want to think about doing a key partnership to manage that for you or take care of that for you because it may be cheaper that way because the outside partner may be able to provide common marketing services to a lot of different firms, and they may be able to do that at a greater economy of scale, and that actually could work better because it would reduce your cost. So there are 4 different types of partnerships one firm might want to think about. One is strategic alliances between non-competitors. 2 is what we call co-opetition, and it's a strategic partnership between or among competitors where you share certain things that you're agreeing to cooperate on, and those are things that you don't compete on. 3 is joint ventures to develop new businesses. And 4 is buyer-supplier relationship to assure reliable supplies, right? So there are basically 4 types of partnerships. And the last one really is the classic supplier relationship. I need a certain material provided to me, and I want to go out and dig for that material myself. So I have a supplier supply that to me. I need a component for my automobile. I don't want to make that component. It's cheaper to get the alternator, the thing that regenerates or that, recharges the battery. It's cheaper to buy that from a supplier. So I make that kind of relationship, right? Now, you can learn more. I'm not going to go through each one of the other types, but you can learn more about them by going out and digging around online. But you need to think about what kinds of partnerships do I want to have. And the book doesn't really address this, but I begin with thinking about what's the competitive advantage of the firm in the marketplace, because you are competing with others. And if something's essential for the competitive advantage, then I probably want to keep that in-house and not put that out of house. For example, with the iPhone, Apple knows that marketing is really essential, so Apple doesn't outsource marketing. But in terms of making the antenna for the firm, they actually outsource that to a supplier. They don't make the antenna internally because they know the antenna is pretty common and that's not a part of their competitive advantage. You don't buy the iPhone because of its antenna. You buy it mostly because of its design, essentially, and the way it's marketed to you. So design and marketing are competencies that they keep inside the firm and they don't externalize, and they don't do through relationships, right? And so what are some of the considerations you want to think about? You know, as I mentioned a moment ago, what's essential? What are the essential aspects for your competitive advantage or for the firm's competitive advantage? Keep those activities within the firm, right? Then the next consideration is optimization and economy of scale. And here it's, you know, what does it take for us to produce enough of what we produce to get that cost down, that unit cost down? And so sometimes, like I said earlier, if marketing isn't essential for your firm, then maybe you want to outsource that because maybe you're not going to be big enough to get an economy of scale there. So, right? Could be that you're not. And so you might want to outsource that. You know, maybe producing a certain component for the product, it's not essential for your competitive advantage, and you're not going to get the kind of economy of scale you need to make it competitive, so outsource that. We're back to the alternators used on cars. You know, car companies outsource those. They have suppliers provide those, right? The other thing you want to think about is reduction of risk and uncertainty. You want to think about how to reduce risk, and sometimes outsourcing through certain single sourcing through a partner may get your economy of scale down, but it may increase your risk, right? So sometimes when you're going after economy of scale and outsourcing and making these partnerships, you may want to think about having 3 suppliers versus 1, because the 3 suppliers might actually reduce your risk. What if one of the suppliers went out of business? Correct? And if you were, if they were your single sole supplier, you then might be putting the firm at risk. I know in the past I worked in publishing, and when we single sourced paper for our printing presses, that was great. We saved money. We got our economies of scale up, because we pushed everything through one supplier. But then when they had supply problems, we put our publications at risk because we didn't have a backup supplier, right? We had no redundancy there. So sometimes we have to make a trade-off between economies of scale and risk reduction or uncertainty. Now, for the last point, acquisition of particular resource and activities. It's the kind of partnership that you need when there's a major component, such as a platform, and you don't want to have to create the platform for multiple reasons. So let's talk about an example. An example would be a phone company. What about Motorola? They do make phones, right? But they don't create their own platform or operating system. They use Android, but that means that they need Google Android as a partner because they want to use that. It's much more efficient for them to make that platform because that platform is already widely deployed and widely accepted. It has a big install base, so they get huge advantages by making a partnership with Android through licensing so they can use Android. Right? So they can use that as their operating system. And that's far better than them trying to create their own operating system. Microsoft tried to create its own operating system for phones and pretty much failed at it because they just didn't have the install base. And app developers, they were already doing apps for Android. They were doing apps for iOS, for Apple. And now a third party comes along. And so it kind of says that the market can only bear so many platforms because of switching cost issues. And so sometimes if you're going to play in that particular market, you need to, acquire a particular resource or activity. So instead of developing your own operating system, you go out and license it and get it, and you get into the market that way. So now let's move on and talk about our last building block, number 9, cost structure. And number 9 is important because it pulls it all together for us on the left side of the house, right? This verifies if all of the operations collectively together can be done in a way that the costs add up to something that is less than the revenues we're going to bring in, right? Again, our entire business model has to balance out for this as a system to work. The organization will not be sustainable if we do not have it balance out. And this is the final piece, looking at the integrative cost structure, right? And that cost structure has to balance against the revenue side or the right side of the house. And so what are we concerned about here? We're concerned about pulling together all of the activities and things that we're doing. And so we want to look at overall, is our firm more cost-driven or more value-driven? And this goes back to this idea, am I providing a low cost? So is the low cost the value that I'm providing out to the consumer, to the end user? Or is it more differentiation, bells and whistles? If it is low cost, such as Walmart, then I have to do everything I can to keep that cost structure as lean as possible. So I do try to completely optimize efficiencies, therefore. If, on the other hand, I'm doing a value-driven proposition out to the customer, so I'm doing the bells and whistles, so I'm Neiman Marcus, then I worry less about the costs themselves and worry more about the value being exquisite and fantastic. I worry about the bells and whistles truly being robust. I worry about it being luxurious. So I do worry a little bit less about optimizing the cost, but making sure that the costs are giving me the kind of quality that the customer expects or needs, right? So we have to think about that first and foremost. Next, we need to think about our cost structure dividing into two broad areas. What kind of fixed costs do we have, and what kind of variable costs do we have? Fixed costs are usually refer to things that are less dependent upon production scale. So for example, if I have a big factory warehouse, I have to pay X amount for the mortgage or for the lease per month, no matter whether I make 10 items that month or 100,000 items that month. That's a fixed cost. The CEO of the company costs $12 million a year. That's a fixed cost. It doesn't matter how many cars we produce that year. That CEO costs me the same amount. So often overhead is considered fixed cost because overhead are those senior management people and their salaries and the nice big headquarters building. That cost isn't really going to change much depending upon the economy or upon the scale. Now, variable costs do vary. If I make more cars, I use more from myself. I use more alternators and I use more seats. I use more steering wheels, right? If I make fewer cars, I use fewer of those items. So they vary. Those costs vary depending on the number of units that I make, right? So we can categorize our overall cost into two broad categories, fixed cost versus variable cost. The last point is economies of scale versus economies of scope. So economies of scale, typically the more I make, the more I reduce my variable unit cost, right? So typically suppliers give me a better price on my alternators if I buy a whole lot of them versus just buying a few of them, right? Because it reduces their cost. If they can get assurances from me that I'm going to buy a whole lot from them, then it reduces their risk in the marketplace, and therefore they can buy much more material at a better cost. They can produce more alternators, and they can pass that reduced cost on to us. So that's an economies of scale, meaning the greater the scale of our production, the lower the cost, the unit cost to us. And think about this too, the more I produce, the more my fixed costs come down per unit as well, right? I can look at my fixed cost per unit. If my CEO costs me $12 million a year and I produce one car, then I've got $12 million of costs associated with that one car. But if I produce 100 cars, then it's only, if I produce 10, it's 1.2, and then it's 0.12, right? So I can play the game of getting my cost down by getting the scale up. The next one is economies of scope, and that's a little more complicated to understand, but economies of scope essentially says that if I've got an internal department such as marketing, the more, any kind of overhead, so even basically the CEO that I just mentioned, the more that I can do for those particular activity areas, then the greater the economies of scope. So for example, if I'm paying X amount for a marketing group, the more that I could do, the more products that I can sell without increasing the size of the marketing group, I'm getting a greater economy of scope, right? I'm using that expertise and spreading it across many more product lines, and therefore I'm getting an economy of scope of work, actually. So that pretty much ends our discussion of all the various 9 building blocks of a good business model, which then helps us to craft a good business plan. And what we do next, and what the book recommends, is that we, in terms of deploying and using this information, is for you to then try to create a business model for your particular business or organization. And they recommend the use of the canvas. So the canvas takes these 9 building blocks, lays them out in blocks up on a wall, and then you can use Post-it notes to brainstorm and move things around until you get something that feels comfortable for you, that you can then translate into numbers and into a spreadsheet, correct? Because you are going to have to make sure that the numbers ultimately do balance, but this can help you to brainstorm. Putting the canvas up on a wall in large scale can really help you to brainstorm or enable you to brainstorm through the use of Post-it notes and so forth. And we're going to do that actually in class. When we have a class session, we're going to do that. And there you can see the canvas. And again, it covers all 9 of the areas. And it's an easy way for you to brainstorm about, well, what is our value proposition? Who are the customer segments and so forth? And the book gives us an example. And this is the Apple iPod and iTunes, and I know it's very outdated now, but in the day it was a big deal, right? And the two together, having the iTunes store and the iPod together as a system, is what really made Apple take off, right? It really made it work for them. And you can see, if you would have done the canvas, if you were the originators of the iPod, iTunes, this is what it might look like to you up on the screen there. And you can read more about it in the book. Now, the last thing is that the book talks about different flavors, they call them patterns, but different flavors of business models. They talk about the unbundling business models. They talk about the long tail. They talk about multi-sided platforms. They talk about free as a business model, and they talk about open business models. I'm not going to explain those to you. I want you to go read about them. And then when we meet in class and you start generating ideas for your particular business models, I want you to think about these different flavors. Which flavor might be appropriate for your particular idea? Now let's wrap up this discussion or this lesson with some discussion around sustainability. And sustainability takes on so many different meanings. We're concerned about sustaining the earth, our planet. We're concerned about sustaining humankind, I think. And we're concerned about maybe sustaining the animals as well, right? Other living entities. And we're concerned about sustainability of the venture, perhaps, and of other ventures, so we can provide economic vitality. So this idea of sustainability plays out at many different levels. But there are the 3 Ps, or the triple bottom line, as it is sometimes called. And first and foremost, we need to be concerned about the people, sustaining humankind. 2 is the planet, sustaining the earth and other living entities, animals and so forth, plants, right? And the third one is the profit, sustaining the venture, sustaining it enough that it can survive and go on and continue to do the good deeds it's doing, but not to an excessive amount that then damages the other 2, right? So it is a system of the 3 Ps working together. And if any one of those becomes too massive, perhaps, especially profit, it may come at the cost of the other 2. So keep that in mind. But I put people number 1 because we've got to be concerned about the people, right? And that goes back to all of our discussions around ethics so far to date. And I need you to think about that as you formulate your ethical stance vis-a-vis your venture. And of course, if you look at the example in the book, one of the key things is that when you think about your business models, you need to also think about those social and environmental costs. There may be externalities and harms. And as you work out the business model, you may come to realize that, hey, what we're doing actually, while it's maybe doing something good, it's providing access and it's doing some other great things. It's maybe providing income for people that don't have it. It's gap narrowing in some senses. At the same time, some of our processes that are embedded in this business model may be either producing externalities or direct harms to the people involved in the transaction. As you may remember, externalities are costs that neither the producer nor the consumer bear, that are put out in the public in general, right? So that everybody has to pay that cost. So if I pollute a river in the process of making a car, and maybe the consumer of the car lives somewhere way far away, very far away from the river, and I, the producer, maybe don't live on that river either, that cost of the dirty water is borne by the people in the community, right? That's an externality. Now, if the car is dangerous and hurts the people that have bought it, that's a direct harm, right? Because that's involving the people that were the consumers who were involved in the transaction. So we always need to think about this business model as we're developing it. What kinds of externalities and harms are there? And of course, our goal should be to minimize that, to minimize those externalities and harms while maximizing social and environmental benefits, right? So those two boxes are there kind of as placeholders to remind us what we need to be doing. But ultimately, all of that has to be embedded in the various aspects of the business model. And the book gives us this example of the phones for the villagers and so forth. I think it's a nice example, but you need to think about it always in terms of all the aspects of your business model working together so that you minimize or have no social and environmental costs while optimizing the social and environmental benefits. And of course, all of this is going to hinge upon your team collectively arriving at an agreement, consensus about what are our ethical values, what are our morals, and how are those enacted by our business model, our venture, right? What is our ethical compass as a group? And of course, you will ultimately have to determine the numbers that are associated with each one of those boxes or each one of these, components of the business model. We refer to that often as evaluation and control. There are input controls, behavioral controls, and output controls. And input controls are often dealing, you can see up on the screen here, dealing with the internal aspects of the firm, right? Where do we bring our materials in? And what are the social and environmental costs of those materials, right? Then there are behavioral controls, and you can see where those are playing out in the firm or in the proposed business model. And those are really, what are the processes of the firm? And then lastly, we have output controls, and those are what are the outcomes that are experienced by the firm. It's certainly social and environmental costs as well as social and environmental benefits are outcomes. If we do everything else correctly, then we should have minimal social and environmental cost outputs, while we have optimal social and environmental benefits that are output. But we will need to, over time, as you develop the actual business plan, you'll have to transition from the conceptual components into actual numbers to verify that everything works together as a system. And your coaches will help you to do that. Lastly, this goes back to some of the early discussion we've already had, previous lessons around gap narrowing or making sure that your firm is a zebra, right? The zebra was the term that was coined by Dan Lyons in his work to kind of help us understand how we could be gap narrowing and sort of more inclusive, engage more inclusive practices within our firms, and to get more inspiration about that and to learn more about how you might, in a practical sense, embed positive behaviors and practices in your firm as you develop it in your venture. You ought to go to zebrasunite.com and get more information there. Maybe even join them, okay? Well, my friends, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson. Make sure you go back to the syllabus and DGA, review them carefully so that you understand what is required for the next module, both the readings, the watchings, the video watchings, as well as all the deliverables. I thank you.